Stood in the doorway of our bedroom. Her bedroom, really, because I hadn't been able to think of it as mine in the 2 years since she passed. And I knew something was wrong before I could even name it. The closet was open. The top shelf where I could even name it. The closet was open. The top shelf where I kept her things looked different. Lighter. Her hatbox was still there. Her winter scarves folded the way she always folded them, edges tucked under. But the wooden jewelry box she'd inherited from her mother, the one with the small brass latch that never quite closed right, that was gone. I told myself I'd moved it. I told myself I'd put it somewhere else and simply forgotten. I'm 62 years old and I forget things now, small things, where I put my reading glasses, whether I'd already taken my blood pressure pill. So I went through the room methodically, the way you do when you're trying not to panic. I checked the dresser. I checked the nightstand. I got down on one knee and looked under the bed, which took me longer to get back up from than I would like to admit. The box was gone. My son-in-law was downstairs. I'd heard him come in about an hour earlier while I was out back pulling weeds along the fence. He and my daughter had moved in 8 months ago after his job relocated them from Phoenix. And we'd agreed it would be temporary, 6 months at most, just until they found a place. 8 months later, his shoes were still by the front door, and his protein powder was still on my kitchen counter, and I was still telling myself it was fine. I came down the stairs, and he was on the couch, watching something on his phone with one earbud in. "Hey," I said, "have you seen the wooden box from the top shelf in my bedroom? Small brass latch, about this big." I showed him with my hands. He didn't look up right away. That was the thing I noticed first, the half-second delay before he pulled the earbud out. "Oh," he said. "Yeah, actually, I was going to tell you about that." I waited. "Sasha wanted to use it for her jewelry, and I knew you weren't using it, so I took it to that resale place on Caldwell, the antique consignment shop. They gave us $60 for it. I figured it was just sitting up there collecting dust." I heard the words. I understood each one individually. But my brain kept trying to reassemble them into something that made more sense. "That was my wife's," I said. "I know, but her mother gave it to her. Before her mother died, that was the last thing her mother gave her." He shrugged. Not an aggressive shrug, not a defensive one. A shrug of mild inconvenience. I didn't know that. Nobody told me it was off limits. I didn't say anything else. I went back upstairs, sat on the edge of the bed, and looked at the empty space on the shelf for a long time. Her name was Lorraine. We'd been married 31 years. She died of a pulmonary embolism on a Tuesday morning in March 2 years ago, while I was at the grocery store. She was there when I left. She was gone when I came home. 31 years and she was just gone? In the time it took me to buy milk and coffee and come back. I'd kept that shelf exactly as she left it. I hadn't moved a single thing. People told me it wasn't healthy, that I needed to let go, that Lorraine wouldn't want me living in a museum. Maybe they were right. But that shelf was mine to decide about, not anyone else's. I called the consignment shop the next morning. A man answered, friendly voice, older, the kind of man who says, "You bet," instead of "yes." "I'm looking for a wooden jewelry box," I said. "Small, dark walnut, brass latch. Someone brought it in yesterday." "Oh, sure," he said. "I remember it. Beautiful piece, hand dovetail joints. You're the original owner?" "It belonged to my wife. She passed away." There was a pause on his end. "Well," he said slowly, "sir, I'm glad you called. We haven't put it out on the floor yet, but when my wife was cleaning it up last night, she does the restoration work here. She found something inside, in the bottom panel." I gripped the phone tighter. "What do you mean, inside?" "The base of the box. It's got a false bottom. Lifts right out if you know where to press." "Lorraine, I'm sorry, was that her name?" "The tag your son-in-law left said Lorraine." "Yes, that was her." "There were some things in there," he said. "Papers. Letters. I put them aside. I didn't read them. I want you to know that. My wife noticed the compartment and we looked just enough to see they were personal. We set them in an envelope and I've been wondering what to do." I sat down at the kitchen table. Letters. In a false bottom. In a box that had sat on that shelf for 2 years and for 31 years before that, and I had never known there was a false bottom. "I'll come get it," I said. "Today. I'll come today." The shop was about 20 minutes from my house. One of those old brick storefronts on a main street that had somehow survived the last 3 decades of strip malls and big box stores. The man behind the counter was named Georgius. He told me without being asked, the way people do when they want you to feel safe. Late 60s, flannel shirt, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He set the box on the counter between us, and beside it, a plain white letter-sized envelope. "I didn't charge anything," he said, "for the cleaning. That's not right, charging for something like this." I thanked him. I paid him the $60 back for the box. He tried to refuse it, and I insisted. I drove home and sat in the car in the driveway for a while before I went inside. I put the box back on the shelf first. That felt important, putting it back where it belonged. Then I sat on the edge of the bed with the envelope in my lap. There were 7 letters inside. Handwritten. The paper was soft at the folds. The kind of soft that comes from something being opened and refolded many times over many years. The first one was dated 22 years ago. The handwriting wasn't Lorraine's. "I keep thinking about what you said at the conference. I know we agreed this was impossible, but I can't stop thinking that maybe impossible is just a word people use when they're afraid of what's possible." I read it twice. Then I picked up the next one. They were from a man. His name was at the bottom of each letter. First name only, Elliot, and as I read through them in order, a timeline assembled itself that I did not want to see. Elliot and Lorraine had met at a pharmaceutical industry conference in Chicago. This was when she was still working, before she took early retirement at 58. She'd traveled for work 4 or 5 times a year for most of our married life, and I had never once questioned it because I trusted her absolutely and completely and without reservation. The letters went back and forth across 9 years. I could only see his side of the correspondence. She must have kept copies of her own letters too, because there were 2 that had clearly been written in her hand, though I had to hold them up to the light to read the faint pencil impressions where she'd pressed hard enough to leave marks on the page beneath. She was always a hard writer. I used to tease her about that. "You grip the pen like you're trying to keep it from escaping," I'd say, and she'd laugh and say somebody had to hold things down around here. By the time I got to the 7th letter, my hands had stopped shaking. It was a strange thing to go from shaking to completely still, like a storm moving through so fast there's no time to brace. The last letter was dated 8 years ago. The tone was different from the others. Quieter, resigned. "I've been thinking about what you said. That we don't get to choose who we are, only what we do with it. I think that's true. I think you're the bravest person I've ever known, and I think you're making the right choice. I won't write again after this unless you ask me to. I hope you're happy. I think you will be." She had chosen to stay. That was what the last letter said, in its way. She had chosen to end it and stay. I sat with that for a long time. My daughter came home around 6. She works in hospital administration, long days. She's usually tired when she walks in. I heard her drop her bag by the door, heard her say something to her husband in the kitchen. I came downstairs. I set the box on the kitchen table. "Where did you get that?" my daughter asked. "I got it back," I said. "From the shop." Her husband looked at the table, not at me at the table. "There was a hidden compartment in the bottom," I said. "Letters inside. 22 years of letters from a man your mother had an affair with." My daughter went very still. She's 40 years old, and she has her mother's eyes, and right then looking at her was almost more than I could take. "Dad." "I'm not angry," I said, and I realized as I said it that it was true. I was something, but anger wasn't quite the right word for it. Grief, maybe. A different kind of grief than the one I'd been carrying for 2 years, but grief all the same. "I just needed you both to know. Because you brought that box out of this house and sold it for $60, and $60 is what 31 years of not knowing is apparently worth." I looked at my son-in-law when I said that last part. He had the decency to look ashamed. I'll give him that. I went back upstairs. I didn't slam the door. I sat in the chair by the window and watched the street get dark and thought about Lorraine. She'd chosen to stay. The last letter was 8 years ago, and we'd had 8 more years after that. Good years, mostly. We'd gone to Portugal for our 28th anniversary. We'd gotten a dog, a ridiculous golden retriever named Biscuit that ate 2 pairs of my reading glasses and 1 television remote before settling down into a mostly tolerable animal. We'd watched our daughter get married in a garden in Flagstaff on the hottest day of June I can ever remember. We'd had a life. A real one. The question I kept turning over wasn't whether the life had been real. I knew it had been. The question was whether I was allowed to grieve this new thing, the thing I hadn't known, on top of the grief I'd already been carrying, whether there was enough room inside me for two losses at once. I called my older brother the next morning. He's 68, retired, lives out in Vermont, and he has the particular gift of saying nothing when nothing is the right thing to say. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, which is something not everyone can do. "You going to try to find this Elliot?" he asked when I was done. "I don't know yet." "What would you want from him if you did?" I thought about it. Not answers. I've got the answers. I've got the answers. I think I just want to. I stopped. I don't know. Confirm that he was real. That it wasn't something I misread. "You didn't misread it." "No," I said. "I didn't." I told my daughter that evening that I needed her and her husband to start seriously looking for their own place. Not as punishment. Not in anger. But because I had things I needed to do inside myself that required me to be alone in my own house, and I couldn't do them with someone else's protein powder on my counter. She cried. I held her while she did, in the kitchen, the way I used to hold her when she was small, and the world was too much. "I'm not leaving," I told her. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm just asking for my house back." Her husband said he'd start calling realtors Monday. I believed him more this time than I had before, which surprised me. A week later, I found Elliot. It wasn't difficult. His last name was on the return address of 2 of the envelopes. I hadn't noticed at first because I'd been focused on the letters themselves. He had a small LinkedIn profile, a retired pharmaceutical sales director in Milwaukee, mid-70s, by my calculation. I didn't call him. I wrote him a letter, on actual paper by hand. I thought that was appropriate, given everything. I told him who I was. I told him I'd found the letters and that I wasn't writing to confront him or threaten him or cause any trouble. I told him Lorraine had passed 2 years ago in case he didn't know. I told him I'd read his last letter and I understood that whatever it had been, it was over long before she died. I told him she'd been happy, in the years I could account for, that she loved our daughter fiercely and laughed easily and made the best roast chicken I'd ever eaten, and once ran a 5K at 54 years old and cried at the finish line because she hadn't believed she could do it. I told him I was glad she'd had people in her life who thought she was brave. Because she was. I sealed the envelope and mailed it before I could think too long about it. 3 weeks later, a letter came back. His handwriting was shaky now. The handwriting of a man in his 70s. He wrote 3 paragraphs. He said he'd heard she passed from a mutual acquaintance and had carried that quietly for 2 years. He said she had spoken of me often and never unkindly, and that she had loved me in ways he'd recognized even then as something he couldn't offer. He said he was sorry, not for having known her, but for any pain the knowing had caused. He said he hoped I was all right. I read it in the driveway sitting in my car in the afternoon sun, and I sat there for a long time after I finished. I wasn't all right, exactly, but I was something close to it. I was moving in the direction of it. My son-in-law and my daughter signed a lease in late October. A 2-bedroom apartment about 12 minutes away. Close enough that my daughter could still come for Sunday dinners, which she has, every week since they moved out. Her husband comes too. He helped me clean out the gutters in November without being asked, which I noted. I put the wooden box back on the shelf where it had always lived. But I didn't put it back empty. I took the 7 letters and I read them through one more time. Not looking for more pain this time, just looking at them clearly, as documents of a person I'd loved and shared a life with, and only ever partially known, the way we only ever partially know anyone. Then I folded them, put them back in the false bottom, and pressed the panel closed. Lorraine had kept them. 31 years of marriage, and she'd kept them hidden in the bottom of a box. Maybe because she couldn't throw them away. Maybe because they were the record of something that had mattered. The way all the things that cost us something tend to matter. I didn't know. I was never going to know. And somewhere in the last few months I'd made my peace with not knowing, which is the closest thing to resolution that real life usually offers. This past April I booked a trip. Portugal, again. We'd always said we'd go back, and we never had. 14 days, a small hotel in Lisbon, and then a rental car and no real plan beyond that. I leave in 6 weeks. My daughter thinks it's wonderful. My brother thinks I've finally come to my senses. I think Lorraine would have laughed at the idea of me navigating a foreign country alone with a phone I only half know how to use. She would have said, knowing her, that she'd give me 48 hours before I was hopelessly lost and accidentally charming some local woman into helping me find the right highway. I think she would have said it warmly. I think she would have meant it as a kindness. I think she knew better than I did that I would find my way. I've thought a lot about the sequence of events that had to happen for me to find those letters. My son-in-law had to make a careless, selfish decision. George had to be the kind of man who pauses when he finds something personal inside someone else's things instead of just setting it aside and moving on. I had to call the shop the very next morning instead of waiting, the way I might have waited in an earlier version of myself, the version that let things go because confrontation felt like more trouble than it was worth. Every one of those things had to line up exactly right, and they did. I don't think the universe was sending me a message. I'm too old and too practical for that kind of thinking. But I do believe that the choices people make have weight, and that weight lands somewhere eventually. My son-in-law made a choice rooted in laziness and indifference. He didn't ask, didn't think, didn't consider for one moment that something might matter to someone else. And because of that choice, I ended up with the truth I've been living alongside for 31 years without knowing it was there. There's something to sit with in that. Not punishment, not karma, in any mystical sense. Just the plain mechanical fact that how we treat other people's lives, other people's grief, other people's sacred things, tends to come back around in one form or another. What I keep coming back to is Lorraine's last choice. She had the letters. She kept them. But she also stayed and built something real, raised a daughter, grew old beside me, went to Portugal and said we'd go back someday. That took a kind of moral seriousness I'm still trying to fully understand. She looked at what she'd done and decided to do better, not because anyone forced her to, but because she had the decency to recognize that the people in her life deserved more than a half-present version of her. That's not nothing. That might be everything. And then there's what it took for me to write that letter to Elliot. I want to be honest about that. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't natural, and there were 2 or 3 nights where I sat down to write it and couldn't find the words that didn't sound either bitter or falsely noble. What I finally sent was neither. It was just true. That took something from me that I'd had to build slowly over the course of my life. The ability to sit with a hard thing and think about it clearly without letting the emotion do all the steering. I don't know what to call that exactly. Clear-headedness, maybe? The discipline to not react until you understand. The hardest part wasn't writing to Elliot. The hardest part was getting up every morning in the weeks after I found those letters and choosing not to let this rewrite everything. Lorraine was still Lorraine. The 31 years were still 31 years. The Portugal trip was still real. The golden retriever was still named Biscuit and still ate my reading glasses. I had to hold all of that in one hand and hold the new information in the other and decide, consciously and repeatedly, not to let the second one crush the first. That's the work nobody tells you about. Not the confrontation. Not the dramatic moment. The quiet daily decision to keep going. To book the trip. To let your daughter come for Sunday dinner. To put the box back on the shelf and leave it there. I'm leaving for Lisbon in 6 weeks. I've downloaded an offline maps app because my brother's probably right that I'll get lost. I've got a small notebook in my bag, the kind Lorraine always carried in her purse. The kind she said was for lists but was really for whatever she was thinking about that she didn't want to forget. I bought it at the drugstore last Tuesday. I haven't written anything in it yet, but I will.